Camp Shelby was founded in 1917 to train soldiers for the First World War. Derives its name from the first governor of Kentucky, Isaac Shelby, and was named in his honor because the first soldiers to arrive were from Kentucky. The post trained about 60,000 soldiers for World War I, and it was, as a camp, it was temporary, so it was closed and then opened up again in 1940 for World War II, and there it became the second largest training base in the country and had a troop capacity of around 85,000, although it went to about 112,000 at least 2 times. Towards the end of 1943, the first prisoners of war captured primarily in North Africa were shipped from Britain where they were being held because the British camps were getting too full, and they started sending them to the United States. Camp Shelby was one of the first camps to receive them because, again, it was a large training base, had plenty of troops here to do supplemental guard duty and things like that. First prisoners of war to arrive were Italian soldiers who were here only for a short time and then moved on to a larger Italian prisoner of war camp, and then the Germans replaced them, and the Germans remained at Camp Shelby until 1946, and then the ones that had died while in captivity here were moved in 1947. Of the 3,000 German prisoners of war, there were 17 deaths, 16 natural causes, primarily pneumonia, but also some influenza and other medical conditions. However, these conditions can't be said necessarily to relate to the conditions here at Camp Shelby. Yes, it's in South Mississippi and it's hot and it's humid and there are mosquitoes and there are issues, we're at risk like that, but our soldiers, United States soldiers, were in the same conditions. So it really wasn't an issue of public health for them. It was simply, it just happened sometimes back then. You did encounter more deaths from things that we don't see that much nowadays. But there was one suicide, 16 natural deaths and 1 suicide. And the suicide is well documented. There was an investigation to ensure that no other German prisoner of war harmed or hurt or contributed to this. The fellow pretty much was very, very depressed. And the other POWs supported, the investigative findings that, he was just going to do that one way or another. So, that's a tragic thing, and it was unfortunate it happened under the watch of American soldiers, but there was no foul play or anything like that. On the lighter side, there were actually marriages by proxies held at the prisoner of war camp. I mean, there's a lot of good things that happened too. We actually have some documentation of a fellow who married his sweetheart back in Germany by proxy. Something we're not accustomed to today, as one of his fellow POWs was standing next to him in the place of the bride. So it seems a little awkward to us nowadays, but that occurred in the camp chapel. Most of the camps that were training soldiers in World War II had a POW stockade. There were some camps that were just solely built for the housing of prisoners of war. However, most active Army posts at that time did house prisoners of war as well. Really, the deciding factor on whether a soldier was moved to a special camp for more ardent Nazis or they were just generally uncooperative and were discipline problems was really on a case-by-case basis, and it wasn't necessarily the uncooperative nature with Americans that did that, but really risk to the rest of the population. Did having this prisoner of war in with the rest of them threaten their lives because they would be perceived, the other POWs, if they cooperated, would be conceived as collaborating with the enemy or not, or something like that. Or if you had someone that had a mental problem, they would need to weed those out as well. They were German soldiers, they were fighting for their country, and their country decided upon war, and then they were doing their bit for their country. I've interviewed several of the POWs that have come back here to Camp Shelby. They generally had a good attitude about the United States. Most of them are American citizens now. They were well treated and were more nationalistic in their approach to the war than basically fighting for an ideology. That they were brought primarily by trains, although there was transfer by truck from some of the more local camps. We have a lot of evidence of transfer between camps within the system. See, Camp Shelby actually was the hub camp or the main camp for a whole system of camps in Mississippi and Lower Alabama. And Camp Shelby had the largest population, about 3,000 at any one time, but had about an equal amount parceled out in other smaller camps throughout the state. Camp Clinton and Jackson, where the general and staff officers were housed. Loxley, Alabama had a fairly large side camp, and Camp Van Dorn and Camp McCain also had prisoners of war stockades. Officers and NCOs, or non-commissioned officers, could not be compelled to do work. The United States observed the Geneva Convention quite scrupulously, and those exemptions were enforced. For enlisted personnel and non-commissioned officers, they could elect to work and were paid for their labor at rank wage. Basically, they were given wage payments equivalent to the United States soldiers of equal rank. NCOs had the choice sometimes, or in most cases. The non-NCO enlisted personnel were not really, well, yeah, really forced to work, but they were compensated for their labor. Here on Camp Shelby, they were parceled out by their skills. If you had someone who was a cook, they were put to the mess halls. If you had someone that was construction talented or trained or something like that, they were put in construction projects. They helped support the camp, but they did not engage in any type of non-Geneva Convention approved activities. For example, they weren't put to work into factories directly related to war production. For example, they weren't sent to Ingalls Shipyard to build ships for the United States Navy or Merchant Marine. They were put in basically mainstream economic production and the maintenance of the posts that housed them. So that all fit pretty well within Geneva Convention limitations. Their conception of particularly the South was that every farmer, which most people were farmers back then, had a shotgun and was just looking for a German to shoot. Well, that may well have been the case for a lot of Mississippians, but no, they would escape. A lot of them would turn themselves in because really the conditions at the camp weren't that bad. You know, they were fed, they were treated well, you know, they had a decent place to stay. It wasn't like they were being mistreated. So the motivation to escape was mainly out of duty rather than out of need. There was one actually rather humorous incident where two were captured in Picayune. They turned themselves in actually in Picayune. And in interviews and debriefings when they come back to figure out why did you escape, how did you escape, things like this. They had escaped with a plan to get to Mexico. And they thought Mexico was maybe across the Pearl River or something. And of course, didn't have a good. It was difficult for a lot of the Germans to conceive of how large the United States was. And you know, once they were educated, and they were educated here, they taught them geography, which sounds a little counterintuitive. Their trade skills, things like that. There was actually an education program here. They also taught government and politics, and that was probably to help move them away from maybe any kind of Nazi ideology that had been ingrained in them from their experiences since Hitler took power. We have a great letter from General Ramke. He was held at the Camp Clinton prisoner of war camp. He commanded a Luftwaffe parachute division. So it was soldiers, but they were under the Luftwaffe and were paratroopers. And quite famous general. Half of his division was captured in North Africa, and the rest were captured in France. And when he was captured by American troops, I believe it was only a captain that came to capture him, and Ramke, being the old-fashioned German officer he was, asked to see his credentials, and the officer pointed to his men and said, "Here are my credentials, surrender." Anyway, so he was unceremoniously sent over here, and he was always a malcontent at the POW camp in Clinton, not necessarily because he was an ardent Nazi by any means, but that he was a German nationalist and a patriot to his country. He wrote a letter to the State Department in the United States. He managed to get it mailed, which was highly problematic for him, that basically said, why give us democracy? And pointed out the fact that, yes, the Republic failed, Hitler was elected, democracy does not seem to work with the Germans. I don't know, he really didn't specify what to put in its place, bring back the Kaiser or something, and we don't really know, but he did point out the issues there. Of course, he also went out to point out many other things, like how African Americans were treated and how we could, get the moralistic high ground when we were committing, in his views, comparable crimes to what the Nazis were being accused of doing. So, we have a piano that was made here by two German prisoners of war by the name of Junghan and Mook, and they made this piano for children. It's a miniature grand piano. Now the story that we've got, and we've talked to the ladies that was made for, that actually played the piano. The officer who received it from the German POWs, we're not quite sure if they made it for him as a gift or he had to buy it from them. But he was a captain and head of the MP company that guarded the prisoners of war, and you had some very fine craftsmen among the German prisoners of war, like you would find probably any population of 3,000 people. Some people are going to be skilled, and it's made out of local woods and just materials that they could kind of scrounge up around here. And it's a very interesting thing for them to leave behind, and we just received it in 2006. So it's a very new artifact to us, and we're still doing a bit of the provenance work on it. Really, except for the fact they were foreign nationals and under armed guard and lived in a stockade, they conducted themselves like American soldiers in many respects. They even wore American soldiers' uniforms without rank insignia and PW stenciled all over it. But they could wear that instead of their German uniforms, which were going to wear out, depending on how long they were prisoners. So they were allowed to put their German their German uniforms aside, and they still kept them. They weren't confiscated or anything. But on the day-to-days, they could wear either the denim work outfit that American soldiers would wear as well, or khakis, or the appropriate United States version of gear. So now they would use the medals and insignia to barter sometimes with soldiers here on post, civilians, camp guards. There's always, anytime you get a lot of soldiers together for war, there's going to be not necessarily a black market, but a barter system for things where money is scarce and things. But certainly we do have a collection of some of their insignia that former guards and other personnel here at Camp Shelby received from them for cigarettes, gum, whatever. There was a POW camp canteen, which was basically a little general store where they were permitted to buy soft drinks, cigarettes, candy, beer even. Of course, to them, Mississippi beer was rather laughable because its alcohol content was restricted and very, very weak in their opinion. But they were permitted to have some. So that's something you don't really could think would go on in World War II, but it did. The POWs had something called the POWs Camp Support Fund. And they would raise money for this by many ways. You had the craftsmen who would make things and they would sell them in these little general sales. They would put up things, carvings of German aircraft, paintings, just little knickknacks that they would make and sell, and people would buy them. And they would put a little price by it and everything like that, and all the money went to the Camp Support Fund. They also had gardens that they used to both supplement their own diet here, which was adequate. They just preferred to have more carrots and potatoes than they were being provided. But the excess they sold to the local population. And that was a good thing. I mean, you've got American population being rationed. So here's this extra source of potatoes and carrots, and other things as well. So that was great both for them and for the local population in the Hattiesburg area. Now, all the funds that went to the support fund supported their orchestras, and they had several orchestras with the instruments being donated from local charity groups and things like that actually not only were established to help support the American soldiers here at Camp Shelby who were training, but also the German prisoners of war. So they got violins, cellos, basses, horns of all manner from the local population. And they had they had a dance band, they had regular orchestras, very different things, and they were in demand. And the prisoners that were in these groups could go under escort to Hattiesburg to play for functions and things like that. So it was sort of an interesting relationship there. Some very talented musicians indeed were part of the POW population. But their biggest thing, and they actually were permitted a camp newsletter. In the newsletter, roughly half of every newsletter is dedicated to their soccer league, because these fellows absolutely love soccer. And they formed different teams from the different parts of the POW compound, and they played, and you had a championship, and whoever was the champion was the Shelby Meisters, or the Shelby champions. The Shelby champions were trucked to other camps to play their champions, to establish a real pecking order of soccer leagues. So it would not be, although I don't know if they played Aliceville directly. Aliceville is a large camp near Camp Shelby. It would be conceivable they'd be on trucks taken to Aliceville. Now, Loxley and McCain and Van Dorn, where there are other smaller camps, they would participate in this league. So you'd have the Camp Van Dorn POWs brought to Camp Shelby to play a big game on the soccer field. So you had that going on as well. Plus, they had an amphitheater that was built in the POW compound where they would have performances, plays, or operas and things like that as well. You don't want to send skilled, trained soldiers into an area where there's no infrastructure to support them, there's no food, there's no housing. I mean, everything is very scarce. That's how you got the Nazis getting power, basically. You had a lot of unemployed soldiers walking around that joined different political groups and became sort of a military wing of a political group. I wanted to avoid that this time. So when these soldiers were repatriated, generally 48, 49 time frame, mainly 48, it was luck of the draw where they got sent back. If they were from Eastern Germany, they were supposed to go back to the Soviet bloc. And the fellow I spent the most time with interviewing, Ernst Bugisch, was from Mecklenburg, which is in the Soviet sector. So as soon as he got put in Mecklenburg, he turned right around and tried to get back to West Germany, which he eventually did, and then immigrated to the United States. So yeah, really 1948 before most of them saw home again.